Hello and welcome to our live Q&A today at the Co-operative Party. I'm Josiah Mortimer, editor of Left Foot Forward, and I'm here today with Anna Birley, policy officer at the Co-operative Party. We're here to discuss what the future of public ownership is in the 21st century, off the back of a new report that the Co-op Party have just done, Democratic Public Ownership for the 21st Century. Now, the Co-op has been arguing for a long time that ownership matters. They've been going since 1917, as many of you viewers will know. So who owns our economy is a major issue in the debate now. It affects how our economy is run and obviously people's day-to-day lives. But for the past few years, it's been a bit of a taboo on the left, I think it's fair to say. The past few decades, anyway, since the privatisations of the 1970s and 1980s. Today we're in a much different political landscape, obviously, with a shift on the left over the past few years. And I think public ownership is coming much more into the conversation now. The Co-op's been thinking in detail about what public ownership might mean today, and I think that's feeding through to other parties on the left, including the Co-op Party's sister party, the Labour Party. So we're here today to discuss this new report. Thanks everyone for viewing. We've got comments going on the video which we'll be reading out at the end of this. And also, if you're on Twitter, we've got a hashtag which is Ownership Matters. Anna, I'll just kick off and ask you, what's the background to this report? Why are you starting this debate now?
I think public ownership has become a mainstream issue. We feel that there's not a lot of debate, I guess, on whether the status quo is working. It's not, and I think there's a level of consensus and public sentiment that we've got a broken system. So we're quite excited to be part of that discussion now, not on whether we do something about it, but how we go about bringing things into public ownership. And so this report is the beginning of a piece of work around ownership and public ownership and democratic public ownership and some ideas on the detail and the technical elements of that discussion. I think it's worth saying that it's not a new debate for us. As you mentioned in your introduction, we'd say we're a party of public ownership, but the difference perhaps people might see is that so those early cooperative shops we were founded from the cooperative movement, where men and women came together to challenge an exploitative system, and they started shops owned by their consumers, and we'd say that's public ownership in its sort of purest grassroots form, because it's owned by normal people rather than these big businesses taking profits out anywhere. So sort of applying some of those early grassroots examples into practical ways we can apply that to our wider economy. I guess is our starting point, and we're really excited about it.
Yeah, I guess the question of public ownership is kind of one of language as well. I guess nationalisation is really the big taboo over the past few decades, and the report, I think, looks at a variety of different models of public ownership, whether that's municipalisation, local councils taking control. How do you think that debate will go? What do you think are the best models for example, dealing with our broken rail industry?
So the report looks at sort of three main types of ownership. So we talk about cooperative ownership, so that's whether it's consumers, workers, other stakeholders collectively owning and having a stake and a say. We look at national government ownership, that could be, we talk about things like the national grid in the report, for example, being something that might be appropriate to be run as a national organisation still. And then we talk about municipal ownership, and that would be local authorities owning it and having a controlling say and stake in how it's run. And they're really complex industries. We've picked rail, water and energy because they're three of the worst in terms of the impact that consumers and employees feel, and some of the rogue behaviour of big businesses sort of extracting profit from the system, stuff that we should just be taking for granted, like water. But they're also not the most straightforward ones. So in energy, for example, we've got a whole host of different suggestions and models in the report that hopefully would create good outcomes, not just about making new co-ops, but making sure that we get the best possible value for consumers and create something that's actually accountable and people feel they've got a say in.
This issue of accountability is really important. Yes. I think I think when most people think of public ownership, they probably do think of that top-down model of nationalisation, where it's just one government controlling an entire industry. It's seen as bureaucratic, I think, and also potentially expensive and inefficient. How do you get around that? What are some kind of good examples of alternatives to that?
Yeah, so so a lot of our thinking, we started to try and find good examples of how these industries are run elsewhere. And in water, we're lucky to have one on our doorstep. So Welsh Water, or Dŵr Cymru, if you're Welsh and I've mispronounced it, I'm really sorry. They are a not-for-profit model for water in Wales. And it was because in 2000, sort of the then owners of the company weren't doing very well and they put it on the market. And people came together and created this people's bid saying that actually water's not a profit-making business, it's just a right that we all have. And we don't get any say over where our water comes from, so we ought to at least have a say in how it's delivered to our doorstep or how much we pay for it. And so they created a not-for-profit model where there are consumers and other stakeholders who have a say in its governance. And we sort of built on that to try and create democratic models like that in water and energy grids. And another really nice example is in New Zealand. So there are a number of different models for ownership in energy. They've got their energy grid, so they're the ones, not the national grid, which is really high voltage, but then you've got regional, lower voltage ones. In London, it's UK Power Networks. They're not the most glamorous end of the industry, but there's real scope for some exciting models of ownership. And in New Zealand, EA Networks, for example, is part owned by the local authority and part owned by a consumer trust. So consumers, by virtue of paying their bills, are seen as owners. And they get a stake in the trust and a number of shares of the organisation, and that means they get a vote and they get dividends if it makes profit, and they get to decide how it's redistributed. So there's some cool examples that we tried to draw on.
All of these sound obviously really effective, important policies that could garner a lot of support among the public. I mean, poll after poll seems to show that there is overwhelming support for taking back control, in the language of the report, of these key sectors. Why do you think this hasn't happened yet?
I think we sort of look all the way back at the government of 45, and we had Labour and Co-operative MPs as part of that government helping to create these national institutions, and it shows that governments set on a particular set of changes can make that happen. But sadly, you've got governments of the other variety, like Thatcher in the 70s and 80s, can reverse a lot of that good work. So I think part of the problem is that opportunity is that we've got the prospect of a government who's got this at the heart of their agenda coming next, and we can make that happen.
Obviously, the likelihood is that government will be a Labour co-op government,
yes.
As many of the viewers I'm sure will be hoping. How much do you think that is on the agenda of that government? Are you seeing these policies kind of feed through into, for example, Labour Party policy?
I think so. The manifesto last year had clear commitments to public ownership, which is really exciting, and I think it's sort of like I said before, kind of conclusion that public ownership's a good way forward and that the system's not working. So now we've got all sorts of smart people across parties and think tanks and everywhere coming up with ideas. So we sort of thought we'd make a positive contribution about how co-op values can underpin some of that. So it's one of many contributions to that development, I'm sure, but it's important we hit the ground running.
Do you see, the Labour Party held a conference on alternative models of ownership
Yes.
back in February. Do you see the language that the Labour Party are using as reflecting these kind of co-op values, or do you think there's a way to go yet?
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really exciting conference, and my colleague Claire McCarthy was able to speak at it, and I think that was when John McDonnell launched a piece of work that NEF are doing an independent report on doubling the size of the cooperative sector. There's really interesting alternative models of ownership paper that he'd published ahead of that. So I think there's real appetite across the political spectrum to look at some of these, what's a good alternative. We're at an opportunity to create a really exciting programme in government. So certainly some really exciting conversations happening.
Yeah, sounds it. I have to ask the question, how do we pay for this? Often the idea of public ownership has been slapped down, I guess, by the right claiming it's going to be too expensive, it's going to cost billions of pounds. How do you challenge that?
Well, I think a starting point has to be the cost of privatisation. So privatised industries haven't saved us money. When you look at the balance sheets in rail, for example, the only main ways of funding our railways have been, since privatisation, the ticket sales and the taxpayer. and the contribution of private investment in that is really minimal. And sort of the profits they purport to have and the amount that they apparently put back into the treasury is actually indirect subsidies via other parts of the industry, means that's sort of clever accounting rather than a massive amount of private investment going into our sectors. In water, when they privatised it, the government wiped all of the debt off the water industry. So they sort of started life, these new private companies, as completely debt-free in the black organisations, and their debt has skyrocketed. And if the debt goes up like this, the private investment has been like this, and that's only been because of state intervention, because they have to submit business plans through Ofwat, which forces them to commit to a certain amount of investment in the industry. So there's a sort of privatisation is really expensive, and I think that's part of the thing that's missing from the conversation about public ownership, is actually the private sector has cost us so much that if there are upfront costs in bringing it back into public ownership, they're offset by having a much more efficient and affordable sector afterwards. Some of the proposals in the report we think are sort of cost neutral or near about. So when we're looking at rail, for example, again, we talk about when franchises come to an end, either because that's the date they're meant to end anyway, or when they fail. So like we've seen with some of the Virgin contracts, for example.
Yeah.
They failed and came to an early end, and that would be an opportunity to speed up the delivery of this. But just not awarding it to another private company doesn't cost them something. It is not an expensive option. And I think we haven't written a paper on the costs of public ownership, but we're trying to come up with models and governance and an aspiration around what democratic forms might look like. But I think some of the costs that are bandied about are a bit scaremongering. The water industry would have you believe it would be deeply expensive because they don't want to give up they're really profitable businesses for these big companies. They are renowned the world over for being a fairly straightforward cash cow. Got Macquarie used to own Thames Water, and as owners they took out billions of pounds in profit, and meanwhile Thames was so underinvested in that its key infrastructure broke and they poured sewage into the rivers, which got them a record fine. So the numbers don't add up now. I think there are big numbers being bandied about by people who don't want it to happen. And I think, people have said that actually how much it costs at the end of the day is going to be a matter for Parliament, and that's a discussion that still has to happen once we know exactly what we're planning to do.
Do you think this is a way of, these new ideas of ownership are a way of challenging that kind of right-wing narrative then?
I think the more detail we can bring, and the report seeks to provide a level of technical detail that we maybe haven't as a co-op party put forward previously, is a way of reassuring perhaps. It doesn't necessarily take a piece of right-wing narrative and demonstrate the ways in which it's wrong, but we tried to be fairly coherent in our analysis of what's gone wrong in privatisation, and the report sets out a number of ways that we believe that democratic public ownership can create a better situation. So we look at protection against underinvestment, for example. We think that the report puts out the case that when you've got a strong consumer and worker voice at the heart of how something's run, you can't get away with underinvestment because those consumers and workers won't put up with it. And now they won't put up with it, but they've got no choice but to pay a bill. But if you've got a say over the way that your business is run and the way that your services are delivered to your tap or your light switch, then you're not going to stand for a situation where you're not getting enough investment for that to go properly. So we sort of have sought to put across some positive arguments that perhaps counteract some of that narrative.
Because that has been a critique of public ownership in the past, I guess, isn't it? This idea that the state would want to keep taxpayers on board and therefore might not necessarily give the investment that it needs. But this is a way of kind of getting around that, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it's a way of protecting against that, certainly, because what we like is to create models which will survive unfriendly governments as well as be supported by friendly ones.
So make it Tory-proof.
Well, yeah, quite. Make it Tory-proof. Make sure that consumers and employees, regardless of who's in charge in government, still get a say over the way their water's delivered to their door, even if the government might have different opinions to them. So I think it requires our next Labour and Co-op government to make some of these changes, but then we want to design a system which outlives sort of the friendliness of the government necessarily.
It's quite a scary thing for a government to do, though, isn't it? I guess to take over these industries from large companies and then straight away hand that power back to workers and consumers. Is that going to be a hard sell?
At the moment, the government has almost no control, and actually a system where employees and consumers have a voice and government has an important role as well, means that when those public policy considerations come up, so the environment, for example, there's a real public policy driver in the way that decisions are made. Currently, if the government wants to build a new generation of nuclear power, so putting aside the debates about whether nuclear is the right way to decarbonise. No, I mean, we don't go there. But, for example, say that's your stated policy. The moment the board of EDF has more say over whether we get a new generation of nuclear power than the government does. So actually, public ownership through democratic forms, devolved forms involving consumers, the report argues that the government gets a greater say and greater influence in terms of policy than a system where you've ceded that control completely to whether or not it's commercially viable for a private business. And most of those private businesses in some parts of the sector are actually governments, just not ours.
Well, this is the issue, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, the Conservatives always talk about, opposition to state control of industries, and then I think the figures are something like half of all journeys taken every year are made on foreign state-owned companies.
It's extraordinary. And obviously, if those countries have democratic systems, those voters get a say over how our railways or energy is run, but ours don't, and that doesn't seem like an appropriate or accountable system.
Is that the case for, I know it's the case for rail, is that the case for other sectors too?
Energy, certainly, that's a big factor in the way our energy companies are currently owned. So EDF, for example, is French government. You've got Chinese government ownership. The Russian government a Russian company, Rosatom, were looking at building nuclear at one point. I don't think they got the permission in the end, but
it's a recognition that ownership matters, right?
Ownership matters. The Scandinavian countries have own parts of our energy infrastructure, and then the big companies that own stakes in the grids and so on. Some of those are sovereign wealth funds. So they're sort of government-owned, government-controlled or linked with, but it's certainly not our taxpayers who are getting their final say.
For the industries that are owned by companies or even those owned by governments, actually, when we take them over, is there not a fear that there's going to be capital flight? There's always talk of scaring the markets.
Yeah, we thought quite hard about that when in thinking about this report, and the report looks at sort of a series of steps, particularly in water and the energy grids, where we're proposing these regional models. And the report has steps because we can see that you can't necessarily do something overnight. A lot of the investors in those industries invest in other parts of British manufacturing, and how you treat some investors might scare the horses with others. So it is important to be careful and regular communication. But the water sector, in the report, it seeks to differentiate a little bit between kinds of investors. So you've got pension funds own a lot of infrastructure in the UK, and actually at the end of the day, a pension fund is ordinary working people who have put money aside all their life, and then they want a sort of low but steady return on that so that they've got something to live on in their retirement. And that doesn't feel wrong at all. There's sort of long-term interests that align with the interests of consumers and workers in those industries in the UK. So we might say that those investors, perhaps, we want to encourage and welcome, and we need to put in place fair principles of treatment. So in the water section here, for example, we talk about having a new principle of fair treatment of those kinds of investors, so that we're not scaring them away. We reassure that...
Keep them on side.
Well, we make it obvious that Britain's a place you can invest in, and we don't scare them off. But then there are other investors that deliberately choose British utilities to exploit them.
Mm-hmm.
I've got the numbers here somewhere, but it's one of my favourite examples to talk about is Thames Water. And they were sort of owned by this big Australian bank, Macquarie, for 11 years. They had this pyramid of companies that owned it. So to draw we wanted to put a diagram of the ownership of Thames water in the report, and it doesn't fit on a page. Like there's so many tiers to it, and half of them
Maybe
are
an
in,
art exhibition.
not quite. And lots of them were based in places like the Cayman Islands, and they weren't paying tax on their profits. And I've got that they were making returns of up to 19%, which just seems an extraordinary amount of money to come out of the system, particularly if you're not paying tax on those. So they paid £1.6 billion in dividends. Bills go up the entire time. Anyone who lives in London who's watching will know that their water bills are getting more expensive. They built up a pension deficit of £260 million. So that's the employees of Thames Water's pensions. So when they retire, they're going to find that Macquarie investors have taken their pensions away.
It's a sort of large-scale asset stripping then.
Well, it does come across like that, and it's all based on bits of research by the Financial Times and the Open University, and the report goes into a bit of detail and shows you where you can find the research behind those numbers. I haven't invented them. But just as a whole, you've seen sort of debt increase, dividends have remained stable. I think SSE have increased their dividends every single year since '92. It's just sort of, it's not behaviour that we'd necessarily want to welcome. So I don't know if that's the kind of investor we want elsewhere either. We don't talk about other parts of the economy, but we are careful to set out steps to keep the good ones on board and make sure that we don't.
In a lot of these areas, that the argument has often been, well, at least when these industries were privatised, that it would increase competition, that would create more kind of choice for consumers. Obviously, that becomes a laughing stock when, if you're in a region like, well, any region, you don't have any choice over which water provider you have, for example. So, is this also a way of, kind of from a left-wing standpoint, increasing competition in the system?
I think natural monopolies, the report is quite clear that you can't put competition on a natural monopoly. You can't, if we were to sort of double up the pipes, perhaps you could pick which one delivers your gas to your home, but we don't have a situation. No. So in natural monopolies, the way that they've tried to mimic competition is through these regulatory formulas that they came up with. So it's every 5 or 7 years, depending on the industry, you go to the regulator with a business plan, and you go, oh, this is our business plan, the customers like it because we've got this panel, but essentially this is the amount of money we want to borrow and this is how much we want to charge customers, and then the regulator goes, yes, no, maybe, change this bit. But it's not competitive at all. There's no competition, and the sort of driving ideology behind privatising some of them was this idea that Sid or whoever,
tell
likewise
Sid,
we'll be too young to remember the adverts, but
I've seen it on YouTube.
We've put the YouTube clip on our website for anyone who would like to indulge in some nostalgia. But the idea was that we were going to have this popular capitalism, that everyone was going to own a slice of infrastructure, you'd buy and sell shares, you'd have this kind of ownership revolution, as it were, but sort of a Thatcher version. It just didn't happen. Like day one, people were selling their shares on already, and now if you look at water companies, for example, only 2 of them are still publicly listed, and the rest of them are completely off the stock market. You can't buy and sell them except through big backroom deals between massive companies. So ownership has narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, and you've got single big investors owning vast swathes of the British infrastructure. So there's this investor in Hong Kong, Li Ka-shing, he just retired. He's the richest man in Hong Kong, and he owns a load of different energy grids, water grids. He owns a bunch of ports. He owns a mobile phone network. He owns Superdrug. Like the idea that we've got sort of a popular capitalism where a single investor and his subsidiary companies can own that much of our country's business and infrastructure is extraordinary. So I can't remember the original question now, but we've got to a place.
Yeah, I guess it's about kind of competition, and I think ironically the offshot of that is that, when you have cooperatives, more people will be owning shares in these industries than maybe would be now.
No, absolutely, and sort of by virtue of paying your bill, you then own a stake in that piece of infrastructure because you're the main sort of recipient of service.
And share through that.
It's funded through your contribution, so why that doesn't result in ownership is what we've sought to tackle. And
how long do you kind of foresee this stuff taking place? I mean, is this a very long-term goal, or would you kind of try and rush it through in the way that maybe Margaret Thatcher tried to rush through her privatisations?
There are different. So we've got quite a lot of detail. It's one of the longest reports we've written for a while. Quite a lot of detail on the how. but it really depends in different industries. So rail, for example, some of those franchises will come up quite soon, some of them will come up later, and that might be a gradual approach. And as franchises fail, which we've seen happen, that can be much faster. In water, we've put down what sort of the first quick steps are. There are quick wins around cutting down on that tax avoidance behaviour, for example. And some of it might be longer term. So transitioning into, we suggest in the report, companies limited by guarantee that will be owned by an employee trust and a consumer trust. And every employee would be a member of the employee trust, and they'd have a democratic voice and vote, and every consumer would be a member of the consumer trust, and similarly democratic owner, and they'd be the joint owners. So creating those trusts might be a fairly easy, straightforward first step to do, but transitioning the ownership might happen over a slightly longer period of time by virtue of different bits of legislation having to go through Parliament, requiring changes to the way that the industry is regulated, sort of as investors decide to leave the market because they can see what's coming. I think, yeah.
I might make it quicker.
there'll be sort of quick wins and medium and longer term ones as well.
Yeah. I mean, what's your priority in terms of starting off that long struggle for taking back control?
Winning the next election.
True, yeah.
But once that minor thing's out the way, I think it's about, you know, being really clear in your legislative timetable, and, you know, it would be down to the government. But I think what's really good is that this and other bits of work across the Labour family is seeking to come up with some of that technical detail. And so what's really exciting is to make quite a technical contribution in this report. And hopefully it means that the collection of everybody's best ideas will create something that is fairly straightforward to implement from day one.
Yeah. And obviously trade unions will have some sort of kind of opinion on this. Have unions been a kind of leading voice in this, or is there kind of some tension over the role of, for example, employees being on industry boards?
Absolutely. These are industries where lots of the employees are unionised, so it's really important that the whole Labour family is working together. I know that, you know, we reference quite a lot of work that the unions have done in here, so substantial references in very small font, but worth having a look through if you're interested to find more. Sort of the Co-op Party and the union movement, we work very closely together in the way that we develop policy, and we make sure that we're talking regularly to relevant unions on relevant topics. So last year I was working on some education policy, for example, and we draw on work that we've done with NASWIT around cooperative schools. So it's sort of try and make it as...
It's all in dialogue.
Very cooperative party if we weren't cooperative in the way we developed our thinking.
You don't ride roughshod over the Labour family. I think that makes sense. Just coming back to this conference that your sister party Labour had in February, do you think that they are looking kind of in depth enough at this, or I mean, Jeremy Corbyn used the phrase he wanted a catapult into 21st century public ownership, which I really like.
Yes.
Is that something, you know, when they're writing up the manifesto, is there going to be, you know, a lot of dialogue between the two?
Yeah. So in the last manifesto, we were really pleased to see a lot of sort of cooperative ideas in there. A massive pledge for us was to double the size of the cooperative sector. So I think there's clear evidence of that strong relationship and dialogue when we're developing manifestos and policy platforms for elections. But absolutely this idea of sort of catapulting into the 21st century, everyone's looking at what a really modern system looks like and how do we make sure that it meets the needs of a modern infrastructure. How do we develop things that account for the transition to renewables? How do we make sure that we are creating models that are going to outlive governments? Absolutely sort of all looking in the same modern, future-looking direction.
You're feeling optimistic then about the future of public ownership?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, democratic public ownership.
Democratic public ownership, sorry, yeah, indeed.
Yeah, no, I think it's really exciting, and it's really exciting that there's such sort of consensus. And it was funny, actually, we were looking at comments that sort of Michael Gove made to the water industry, and even he's giving them a ticking off that, you know, change is coming if you don't up your game. And
wow.
The government's own energy advisor, Dieter Helm, wrote a report suggesting parts of the national grid be nationalised. So it's sort of, I don't know if it's going to end up like the price cap where sort of Ed Miliband proposes it and 2 years later it's part of Theresa May's policy. But yeah,
Keep
it's
shouting it loud enough.
exciting time. Yeah.
So you could end up with some Tory nationalisations.
Well, that would be the world upside down. But yeah.
But I think we're living in those times. Definitely. All right. Well, it's been great to talk to you, Anna.
Pleasure,
and
thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Those of you who've
Thank
been
you.
watching, it's been a good debate, and do continue to add your thoughts on our Facebook page and on the hashtag on Twitter, Ownership Matters, and we'll be continuing this debate on Left Foot Forward and within the Co-operative Party as well in the weeks and months ahead. So thanks for joining us. We hope we can talk to you talk again soon about this, and we'll speak to you soon. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye bye.